All right, well, thank you for the invitation from the organizing committee, and I have to also thank them for the title of my talk. They sent that to me and said, can you talk about this? And I said, yeah, I think I can. And what I'm going to do is actually focus on this part of the talk, because I know most of you are professionals working in forestry. You need to decide how you're going to do the applications, or what applications you're going to use to improve productivity, and you're going to decide when to do that. And it's very difficult for a professor to tell you exactly when to make these sorts of decisions. In a general sense, we do know when we should do something. It's when we're going to make the most money from the productivity gains that we know will occur as a result of our application. And we also decide on whether we're going to do something in that context. So, we don't want to fertilize our most productive sites very often, because those sites will respond very little. And all of this, of course, kind of circles around the idea of site potential, which is a very old idea in forestry, which is we have a location on the landscape that we know we can grow trees at some rate. And in the old days, we'd go to a place, we'd measure the rate of tree growth one way or the other, and we would designate that area as either being good or bad based on that observation. And we knew inherently that that was a reflection of many ecosystem characteristics. Climate, of course, is precipitation and temperature, relative humidity, but also includes the deposition of nitrogen and sulfur across the landscape. If you're close to a city, you're probably being affected by ozone, tropospheric ozone, and of course carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere is affecting our site growth. Time is the variable we oftentimes deal with in forestry, which is oftentimes manipulated to some degree with density management, as Jeremy was talking about earlier. Another important feature of time is risk. There's a risk associated with having a long-lived crop on the landscape, associated with fire, associated with flooding, insect outbreaks, hurricanes, etc. And then trees. Now we can manipulate the genetic material going on the landscape. We can also make decisions on whether or not we want to have one species or another. I'm going to be focusing on loblolite pine, but we just heard a great talk about making decisions in reference to hardwood species. And then, of course, our weedy competition, insects, wildlife, they're always giving us some problems, and disease. Landscape position, problem if you have a flat site in parts of Texas, it's not a problem. If you have a flat site in southeast Louisiana, it can be a huge problem for flooding. And we often have thought about growth potential in the context of soils. And this is the traditional way we've identified our potential growth for a region. But as we have grown in our technologies, that designation probably is outdated. That way of designating growth potential is outdated. And this is a question I ask of my students in my silviculture class, which is one of the classes I teach at Texas A&M. Is site a constant? In this, if it were, this site index graph created by Harold Burkhardt and Ralph Amateus in 1985, and connecting that to some GIS layer, this is an example from an NRCS output, that would be adequate. We could still use that information today to predict our growth potential for a site, and then make plans about our timing and application timing of technologies and which technologies we should use. But of course, site potential has been changing dramatically, and that's really well illustrated by this graph that was created by Tom Fox, Eric Chokla, and Lee Allen in a publication in 2007. And what we're looking at on the y-axis is the volume at harvest and what you would expect in different decades. So in 1940, you might, after 50 years of a rotation length, get somewhere south of 2,000 cubic feet per acre. And then with the advent of planting technologies, controlled spacing, we might have bumped it up a couple hundred cubic feet per acre. And then as we move forward into the current decades, of course, site preparation technologies have improved. Fertilization came on in the 60s and 70s. Weed control, tree improvement, open pollinated, and now controlled pollinations. And biotech and clonal material, of course, is changing the field rapidly. And all of this has basically come together to reduce rotation lengths. I don't know, 20 years in many places, but that's the hope that we're going to. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But we're definitely around 25 years for most of our forests. And we are basically 4 to 5 times more productive than we were 50 or 60 years ago. And that's a dramatic increase in productivity. It's the same productivity that many other agricultural systems have seen. And the question is can we count on this trajectory continuing forward into the future? Have we reached the upper limit? And if we have, how can we move beyond it? So someone mentioned a crystal ball later, and I happen to have one of those, actually. So we're trying to look at what the future of that site potential might be. And I always love this quote by Niels Bohr, which are predictions are hard, especially about the future. So we've had this history, and we have some technologies that have been in place for a while, so we can start to evaluate where we might be heading with our potential site productivity. I'm going to talk about technologies in the context of whether they're discrete, meaning they happen at a specific point in time, or whether they're continuous, meaning there's a background change that's occurring. And then also going to talk about probabilistic or potentially stochastic events that can occur on the landscape. Now, fertilization is a discrete event. We go out maybe 1, 2, 3 times in a stand and we fertilize. And we have an increase in productivity that's quantifiable, easily quantifiable. Background CO2, it's been occurring since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, this increase. This graph is from the EPA, and they predicted in 2004 that in the current day we'd be at about 400 parts per million, and in fact that's where we are. So we've had this increase in CO2 that's predictable. And in some ways, these sorts of continuous variable functions are much easier to deal with in terms of predicting future site potential. So intermediate between a continuous and a discrete function is the changes in tree genetics that have been going on. We might roll out new genetics from time to time, but of course there's always this background improvement that is occurring. And then probabilistic events are things like hurricanes. This is a graph or picture of hurricane tracks in the southeast United States for a relatively short time interval. And we'll talk about this more later, but as you can see, and as many of you have probably experienced, including myself, if you live in the South long enough, eventually you're going to be touched by a hurricane or a tropical storm. So just to hit on this a little bit more, this idea of different types of properties in terms of how they affect what we're doing. When you have a variable that's either discrete, continuous, or probabilistic, it determines how you should assess the potential effects in your stand. So if you go out and it's very simple, we think about it in terms of fertilizer and weed control. We go out, we fertilize, and we look for a response. But if there's a background continuous variable that is changing alongside of our fertilization or our weed control, we may either overestimate the potential for that silvicultural treatment to change productivity, or we might underestimate it unless we understand that background variable. It will also oftentimes reflect whether it's a universal or a local driver. Again, the atmospheric CO2 increase is a great example of a universal driver. It's changing everywhere, pretty much, and so we can dial that in. If you're operating at very large landscape scales, you can make fairly large predictions across your land base. And then if you're modeling, and we'll talk about more about modeling at the end, how you treat these variables is going to determine how you do your modeling. So I'm going to put the silvicultural treatments in the context of discrete variables starting out here, and we're going to talk just about prior fertilization or weed control, and whether that changes our site potential. If you want to use this in your operations, changing future site potential through past fertilization or weed control, then of course you need to incorporate that into your GIS layers, or potentially you can link it up to fine scale remote sensing. I'm going to miss the UAV talk later, but I think that would be one potential way that we could take information that was perhaps collected on our past silvicultural treatments and predict how it's going to affect our future growth. I'm going to talk about this in the context of two studies that I was involved with and currently am still involved with while I was at the University of Florida, associated with the Forest Biology Research Cooperative. One of those is the Intensive Management Practices Assessment Center. This is known as IMPACT, and it's located just north of Gainesville, Florida. The other one is the Silvicultural Sustainable Productivity Study, and it's a little bit south of Gainesville, Florida. Both of these are part of the Forest Biology Research Cooperative efforts. And what these studies are set up to do is examine the effect of past silvicultural treatments on this rotation's productivity. And so over here we see the design of the IMPACT site, which is now called the IMPACT 2. And these FWCs, these reflect fertilization, weed control, just bedded and planted with site prep, and then fertilization plus weed control. The CF, subscript F, or CFW, these are carryover treatments where they received fertilization or fertilization plus weed control in the first rotation. In the second rotation, they've just been planted on their beds in the same location as where they were in the first rotation. So in the first rotation, IMPACT received about 1,000 pounds of nitrogen over the course of the rotation. So these are, these studies were set up to try to estimate the overall biological potential for loblolly pine, and 230 pounds of phosphorus, so quite a bit of phosphorus as well, and then also a continuous supply of macros and micros. And the SSPS, which was previously called G8, received about 250 pounds of nitrogen, 90 pounds of phosphorus, and it received that either as DAP or TSP. In the case of TSP, nitrogen was added later as urea. This is the growth dynamics of the two studies in the first rotation. So here is the control site, or control plots, and weed control, and the fertilize and fertilize plus W. And this is a metric. It's published by Eric Jokla in a journal that required that we publish it in metric units. But this is maxing out at about 195 square feet per acre. It probably could have been thinned at around 8 years of age, but based on the stand dynamic, you can tell it wasn't thinned. It was really starting to break up towards the end. But the other thing you should be able to see from this immediately is that there was a sustained increase in productivity as the result of the silvicultural treatments, right? Over here, G8, which was eventually SSPS, at more operational levels, there's an increase in productivity with the fertilization plus weed control. And I should say that included in this fertilization and weed control, there was a mid-rotation woody understory control. But when we looked at the fertilization treatments, they actually dropped off in their effect. There was an initial bolstering of productivity, but by 25 years, the effect of fertilization had dropped off. Weed control was by itself intermediate between those two treatments. So in the second rotation, we compared the growth of that second rotation to the first rotation's growth. So these are 3-year-old stands. This is a 3-year-old stand in 1986. The stand was planted in 1983. And this is a 3-year-old stand in 2013. Okay, so here's a control plot. Here we have the fertilized plot, first rotation, second rotation. And these are actively managed plots right here. And this is the actively managed plot. This is the carryover treatment right here. So just looking at the carryover treatment effects, the fertilizer alone in the next rotation improved productivity by about 30%. If you added weed control to your fertilization treatment, there is no significant effect on the next rotation's growth at age 3 years. And for weed control only, there is a slight decrease. That decrease is not significant. So from this perspective, site potential for this particular site, at least out to 3 years, was increased with fertilization alone, but it's not increased when you combine fertilization and weed control. So, if you're trying to build a GIS layer with that information, you might have a binary code for weed control, FW, fertilization plus weed control, and fertilization. But what you want to do really is get to some sort of continuous explanation of growth response. And that's what we're showing here, which is the amount of forest floor nitrogen at the end of the rotation. So at age 25 for impact, age 26 for G8, this is the impact results. So the control is right here in the middle, the weed control is over on the left, and fertilization, the one significant growth enhancer, is way over here on the right. And it's a pretty strong relationship. G8 is over here. This is only after 1 year's growth, and it's a much tighter grouping amongst the different treatments. Weed control, again, is on the downside of the controls, and fertilization plus weed control is actually even a little bit further south of that. Fertilization alone is having, again, a positive effect on the next rotation's growth. We tried to get these into the same axis by looking at the normalized values. So normalized, this is basically deviations from the control. And again, that impact site, much stronger relationship, but we're talking about very similar relative changes in productivity. We expect that we might be able to close this gap between two different studies with information on some of the other nutrients that were added and might have accumulated in the forest floor. And again, this is just a way of turning that discrete variable into continuous variable, and then hopefully you can incorporate that into a model of changing site potential. And so just to kind of talk and transition into my next topic, this is the control at age 2 years. This is Gary Peter from the University of Florida. So this is a 2-year-old tree in Florida with no silviculture. I should say it's site preparation and planted on a double pass bed. And then this is fertilization plus weed control, so basically a 12-foot tree with fertilization plus weed control. So even looking at this control, I think many of you have been planting trees for a few years. This is pretty dramatic, right? And for those of you who have been planting trees for a while, you probably have seen some fairly significant increases in intensive managed pine forestry. So going from the first rotation to the second rotation, which is illustrating here, for the controls alone at the Impact 2 site, that's a 216% increase from trees that were planted in 1983 versus trees that were planted, actually this should say 2009. Okay. Looking at fertilized plots, it's 56. Fertilized plus weed control, it's 46. And the weed control only, it's about a 50% increase. Looking at the relative effect of silviculture at these two different time points, the control plots in the first rotation were about 138% less than fertilized plots, 200% less than the FW, and about 37% less than the weed control at this age. If we look fast forward to today, that's changed fairly dramatically. So the background improvements that have occurred in genetics, that have occurred as likely the environment has changed in this region, just tree planting technology, how we handle seedlings, both when we plant them and when we plant or we're handling them in the nursery, all that is really increasing this control number. So in one way to look at it is it's also reducing the net bounce we get from some silviculture. Another nice paper that looked at this is from Everett and Palm Lace, and this is from South Carolina, the coastal plain. And going from first rotation to second rotation, this is 1967 versus 1991. In the control, there's about 80% change, and for the fertilized plots, it's about a 66% change. Now, I'll have to point out that in this study, they actually had weed control, increased weed control in the second rotation, which they thought was partly responsible for this dramatic increase. But it's also just a reflection of the overall improvement in genetics and handling of material. And kind of remaking the same point that I made earlier, in the first rotation, fertilization with phosphorus increased their productivity by 80%, but in the second rotation, fertilization with phosphorus is increasing about 14%. So, what's the background change that's occurring? I'm going to talk about a couple of possibilities. I've hit on genetics a little bit, but climate and atmospheric properties we'll start out with. And the big one, of course, related to the atmospheric properties is carbon dioxide. So this is the EPA's projected emission scenarios. Again, this started out at an earlier date, but they have a high emission scenario, which is actually what we're on right now. We're emitting probably the highest estimate that we could for CO2. And then they have a low emission scenario. And then they have what would be the goal. And the goal is set by the scientific community to try to keep atmosphere, or the warming overall in the climate system, to less than 2 degrees Celsius. So we don't want to get above 2 degrees Celsius. And if you were here last year, Jeremy Stovall presented information on this study. This is a elevated CO2 study that was located at Duke Forest in North Carolina. And what they did is they blow CO2 on an intact forest and blow it on there to keep the CO2 levels at some elevated amount. And they hit 570 parts per million, and they kept it around that amount throughout the study. Their ambient CO2 is just a background forest, and it was about 358 parts per million. We currently are about 400 parts per million, so this was quite a number of years ago. And what this graph is showing is that relative response to elevated CO2 increases as a function of nitrogen availability. But it's a pretty substantial increase. It works out to be about 30% on average across this nitrogen availability gradient. So just doing a little back of the envelope calculation, you get about a 0.15% growth increase per part per million from the Duke study. The atmospheric CO2 is increasing about 2.07 parts per million per year. So region-wide growth for loblolly pine, which is, I should say, exquisitely adapted to elevated CO2 levels, is about 0.3% per year. And this is additive, right? So if we have this projected increase in CO2 into the future, I think this is kind of baked into the cake. So if we hit that and maintain that target level of 450 parts per million CO2, you could see 7 to 8% greater annual growth in loblolly pine. So the other big driver, and we heard from Dr. McNulty earlier that the southeast United States hasn't actually warmed, but projections are that it may or it should. And those projections are for about 0.5 degree to maybe upwards of 2 degrees Fahrenheit increase over the next 20 years or so. It's distributed somewhat differently in the winter season. This graph over here is from the International Panel on Climate Change. So a little bit more warming in the summer in the south, a little bit more warming in the winter in the far north. But anyways, what do we know about increasing temperature and overall growth? Surprisingly, not a lot. There's not a bevy of sites or of studies out there that we can draw from, but this is one from Nedlow et al. This is Bob Teskey, Tim Martin, and others, where they planted seedlings in different locations, Athens, Georgia, Macon, Coweta, and Gainesville, and they just tracked their growth over a couple of years. and then they harvested them and measured their mass, and they basically came up with the observation that Coweta was too cool, and Gainesville was too warm, and Athens is the best place in the world to grow trees, apparently. Which I don't know if that's because Bob Teskey's in Athens or not, but it's an interesting result. But of course, if you grow trees across the region, you know that if you look along the coastlines where we have some of our warmer temperatures, it's often where we have our better productivity. And this is actually model output from G. Sun, his collaborator of Dr. McNulty's, and his model, the WASI model. And it's estimating gross ecosystem production, which is basically photosynthesis. So, these regions which are currently warm are currently where we have some of our greatest productivity. And if this region up here warms, it's very likely that much of that will also increase in productivity. So there's a lot of ifs in that statement, but some of the modeling that I'll talk about later seems to be bearing this out. Of course, as most of us know, it's within these local areas, and I should say that each one of these dots is a study site that is part of a Forest Research Cooperative's retinue of study sites, and it's part of the Pine Map project, which many of you have probably heard about. But at a local level, those local site conditions can dramatically overwhelm any sort of regional change affected or caused by climate. And this is just the illustration of that. So all three sites shown here, this is Bogalusa, Louisiana, DeRidder, Louisiana, and Kirbyville, Texas. At age 10 years, all three of these sites are effectively in the same climatic zone. You're looking at 6 different genetic entries of MCP, mass-controlled pollinated lobeloid pine. And this is the net result of a mixed model. So there were actually 2 different silvicultural treatments at the site. I have to say that in this study at age 10 years, silviculture was not significant. Okay? But what was significant was the genetics and the different sites. So Bogalusa, Louisiana was our lowest producing site. It also was hit by, of course, Hurricane Katrina, was flooded for a number of years, so that local site effect was fairly significant there. DeRidder, second best producer, and then Kirbyville was our best producer. And at least if Texas can't beat you guys in football, LSU, if any LSU fans, we can beat you in growing trees in some places. So we got that going for us, right? But so we see this trend very often. This other trend right here, which is our best performing families are consistently performing the best across our sites. Okay, so and pretty dramatic differences. If you can't see this is square feet per acre, and this is volume cubic feet per acre. So I'm going to shift a little bit to the stochastic drivers of change, and it's not quite a change in site potential in terms of what we mostly think about, but it can, from the economics perspective, change our net returns on our site investments. So I'm going to really focus in on hurricanes and drought, but other things that are popping up in some parts of the country. Some of our friends from Arkansas and Oklahoma are dealing with this, are cold spells, and then of course there's always the specter of an insect or other pathogen outbreak dramatically changing our productivity across the region. I showed this earlier. This is the hurricane tracks. This is only hurricanes that tracked through the Gulf of Mexico between 2000 and 2011. Of course, in Texas in 2009, we had, well, in Texas and Louisiana, and all the way up in Arkansas, we had Ike. And we've had many other hurricanes over that time. If you were to predict on 100 years living in a certain spot whether you'd have some tropical storm influence on that spot, I think the probability would be about 1, right? And so the question that we can try to address, I think, at this point in silviculture is, can we do anything about this? We can't stop hurricanes, but we might be able to prepare our stands in anticipation for these events. So this is referring to that same study that I mentioned earlier. These are the different families of loblolite pine. There's actually a slash pine inclusion in one of these research installations, Bogalusa, DeRidder, and then Kirbyville. And this is wind damage assessed at year 10. In the case of Bogalusa, it actually had not been directly hit by a hurricane since Katrina, but DeRidder and Kirbyville actually had just a couple of years prior to, well, 3 years prior to this measurement. And what we observed, however, is that there was a fairly consistent family effect. So there were certain families that had much higher incidences of hurricane damage, and then there was a consistent effect of silvicultural treatment. Now, I mentioned earlier that silviculture was not significant for growth, but it was significant for this effect. So where we had higher levels of silvicultural input in this study, we ended up with lower levels of hurricane damage. And we broke that down a little bit more. A lot of that damage was in the stem sweep that occurred, where poorly developed individuals had a bit more lower stem sweep, probably because their coarse roots were not as well developed as some of the larger trees. Another stochastic event is drought, and this is a graph from Herling et al. 2013 of the 2011 drought, and it's a deviation from a long-term normal for precipitation and temperature, and you can see that that is pretty much square on Texas and parts of Louisiana, of course, as well. The 2011 drought was calamitous in many respects, and one of the ways it was very disconcerting to the public was that they were observing many, many trees dying across the landscape. And so they called the Texas A&M Forest Service and asked them to, tell me what's going on and how worried should I be about it. And the Texas A&M Forest Service, in collaboration with a colleague of mine, Georgianne Moore, they assessed the damage across the state of Texas. And this is just a summary of their research results. Chris Egger, Georgianne Moore, and myself put this together. And what you're looking at is the size difference for trees that died versus trees on the landscape. And this includes all of Texas. So this is west of Austin, going onto the Edwards Plateau. This is East Texas into Louisiana-type precipitation levels. And this is both angiosperms and gymnosperms. Okay, so the size difference between the trees that died versus the trees that are living on the landscape. And what we find is that in our eastern range, or eastern side of Texas, our higher range of precipitations, we lost a greater proportion of our large diameter trees. And I'm sure many of you noted that in your travels around, especially for the two, the angiosperms and the gymnosperms, is the effect was larger for angiosperms. I didn't break it out here, but one of the questions for those of us in silviculture is whether this is something we can try to incorporate into a tool similar to what Steve McNulty was talking about earlier, where we have a 6-month prediction potentially for a region, and if you have a stand that is on the higher end of your diameter distribution, then perhaps it behooves you to think about harvesting in the next 3 years. So I think that's one way where different tools can be connected. This, I should say, is not technology that's ready to be sprung upon the world, but it's something I think worth thinking about. And before I move too much off, or move into the conclusions part, I want to talk a little bit about site potential as a measurement. And I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but I wasn't when I first started teaching silviculture. I taught my students that loblolite pine's site index was not affected by stand density. So I'm not sure if many of you heard that, but or learned that in your silviculture classes. But Harold Burkhart and one of his students came out with a nice paper in 2011 that fairly definitively showed that as you increase stand density, you're effectively decreasing your site index. And so if you have your GIS layer and you have a site index that's based on one stand density, and you plan to shift your planting to more contemporary 400 to 500 trees per acre, you could be dramatically underestimating your site potential for that site. About the 25% seems like a lot. It should maybe not so dramatic when you consider that you're talking about a range of about 3,000 to 2,000 trees per acre. So technologies to adopt. I think that we're at a point where we can start thinking about incorporating past silvicultural practices into our projections of site potential. I mean, it's going to take some GIS information to really make that work in many cases, but I think it's possible. If I were managing large tracts of land, I was trying to make decisions about application and timing of different silvicultural technologies over the next 25 years, I probably would take into account the increasing CO2 levels. And maybe temperature, but again, that's a big uncertainty, and I don't think we're at anywhere near a point where we can start talking about precipitation. But I think you can evaluate some events in the context of the probability of it happening, and this is particularly relevant to hurricanes. It all works out great if our silviculture, where we're trying to maximize productivity, is also minimizing our risk. But I don't know that that's going to be the case for all types of risk. And how do we adopt these technologies? Ultimately, I think it's going to take process modeling that feed into our more traditional growth and yield models. So what I mean by process models, these are ones that take into account both ecophysiological processes and also changing background conditions. And some of that is going on within PineMap. Bob Teskey, G-Sun, Harold Burkhardt, and others are working together to try to make that happen. And I think one of the things I'm excited about is that PineMap has been measuring carbon and nitrogen pools within the soils of different treated stands, pine stands throughout the South. We have about 460 estimates of forest floor nitrogen, and I think we can connect that into a prediction for next rotation productivity, at least early productivity change. And hopefully the long term we'll be connecting this to some sort of remote sensing product, because ultimately that's how it's going to be scaled up. And just as a call out to PineMap again, there was a webinar on Wednesday. It's still available, I think, recorded, that talks about some of this modeling effort that's going on. I also just want to hit on what I think are some important things that we know that we don't know. And one of those is, what is the upper limit for those control plots in terms of the increases in productivity that we can achieve? Meaning, we have this background increase in productivity in stands that are not being intensively managed. And if you look at that closely, that means a potential significant increase or significant cost savings for those of you who are practicing intensive silviculture. And part of that unknown is what really is driving it, and there's breaking it down into a study design would mean some sort of genetics by fertilization, past fertilization, by increasing CO2, by drought and temperature, which is a study that will never happen in any of our lifetimes. But it's important because we need to know whether these are additive, whether they're directly affecting one another, or whether they're interacting with one another. And the only way we're going to get close to answering that is through advanced genomics and, again, this modeling effort. One of the things that keeps me up at night, mostly because I talk to pathologists or geneticists, this is what keeps them up at night, is the possibility of a lurking pathogen. We have developed the loblolite pine resource to such an extent that it is the basis for many economies throughout the South. And you don't have to look very far to see an example of a tree species completely losing out to some invasive pathogen. I'll get to why I think that's important in a second. It's important, obviously, but it's all tied in here in a bit. And then the other thing we should keep in mind is that I put hurricanes, drought in the context of stochastic, probabilistic events, but there's probably some underlying continuous variable that we can potentially tie into, and that's again a part of modeling. So I put all of these up here because this is a call out to all of you, and a reason why I think this is such an important event is that maintaining capacity, research capacity in our federal government, in our universities is really going to be able to let us sleep easy at night. And for that to happen, we need an engaged public, which is all of you, and why these are such important events. So I just want to acknowledge the Forest Biology Research Cooperative, and then and the many member companies, and then Campbell Group and Boise Cascade.
All right, we'll have a 15-minute break now. Let's plan to come back in here at 1:45. Oh, before you leave for the break there, I thought I'd mention that if you need a better receipt than what you printed off, they have hard copies of receipts at the front desk there. All right, thanks.